Welcome to Ream Library. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also sponsor initiatives that foster Jewish-Christian understanding and that help explore global Catholicism from the perspective of lay people around the world. We're happy today to be here sponsoring an event with our critical race and ethnic studies colleagues. And we're, as I think you all know, pretty close to a highly contested election in a country that seems really divided. And in light of that, I'm pleased to welcome David C. Wilson, the Dean of the Goldman School of the University of California, Berkeley, and also a professor of public policy there, for a lecture that will help us focus precisely on the division that we often feel so deeply in our bones. We've all heard explanations for the division, but I know that we're going to hear some different insights today. Professor Wilson is a political psychologist specializing in the use of survey-based experiments to study political behavior and policy preferences. His scholarship focuses on the psychology of political opinion about policies, contentious social issues, and political figures. He's written several articles and books, most recently co-authoring, there you go, Racial Resentment in the Political Mind. He also serves on the Executive Council for the American Association of Public Opinion Researchers and on the Advisory Committee and Editorial Board of the Public Opinion Quarterly. Prior to joining Berkeley's Goldman School, Wilson was Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, and Professor of Political Science and International Relations with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. He also has a background in the United States military. He's held a senior position with the Gallup Polling Organization, leading national and international survey projects examining topics ranging from workplace creativity to prejudice in politics. So please join me in welcoming David Wilson.
Thank you. Oh, this is great. You could just, it's magic. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for the generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'll go through a process of kind of sharing an overview of the talk and kind of some points I want to make. I'll also share a little bit about my background, which relates to a broader concept around identity and how we use identity to think about the broader world around us. I'll share a little bit about my research, and then we'll maybe have some time for some questions, answers, dialogue, and the like, for things I might not have covered in the talk so far. All right. So, democracy. The big idea here is that in a democracy, there are many different meanings of how it should be operationalized, different versions. We tend to be focused on the national level of democracy, but each state has its own constitution. Each locality has its own kind of charter and constitution, so you have versions of democracy that exist at different levels of government. We have a federal system, local, state, national government, and we have different kinds of cultures within each one of those jurisdictions, and those cultures reinforce how we think about who should get what, when, and how, which is what politics really is. So I'll talk a little bit about democracy and how the mind, the political mind, actually makes decisions and how your identity kind of filters or kind of alters different kinds of decisions so that we don't always come to agreement, and it makes it feel like our democracy is kind of in peril and going away, but that's kind of not how it works. It's more of a feeling than it is kind of a fact. And a lot of this is due to a very basic human motive that we have around justice. And so I'll talk a little bit about justice as the kind of connective tissue between the political mind and democracy. So the basic point is politics is how we decide who gets what, when, and how, both in government and in human relations. We politic mostly around those things that we think are important, those cherished outcomes, those statuses, those prerogatives, those material things that we really value. And then when they're distributed out, we make a judgment about whether or not whoever received them is deserving of those things. That is a human process that we can't do anything about. It is natural. When you start making a judgment or going through a process of judging deservingness, automatically you're thinking about justice. Do they deserve it? If you say no, then it's not just. Something's been violated. And a case example of this, of course, is cheating. When someone cheats and gets an A, if you know they cheated, you're going to say that's unfair. And you can't live easily with unfairness. And so I'll talk about the justice motive and how we make attributions based on justice. And then talk about how resentment is a natural reaction to perceived injustices. And then once you have resentment, you are very bought into whatever belief system you have, and you tend to resist change or resist advancement in the status quo. Whenever there's a belief that things are moving a little bit too quickly or society's moving on without really dealing with a problem, that kind of breeds a little bit of resistance to change and therefore belief in the status quo. So this kind of starts with a case about social identity and our human need to belong and be a part of something broader than ourselves. And one thing that identity does is it really focuses on our self, the idea of self-concept, self-enhancement. Believe it or not, that focus on self, that need to kind of understand who we are, how we belong, who we connect with, the value of that connection can actually promote polarization and human suffering across a host of different ideological and identity lines: race, gender, party ID, belief systems, and the like. So today, we tend to view politics through a lens of feeling more so than facts. We're inundated with information, and that information has an effect on our minds that works much faster than our conscious awareness understands. And so you sometimes feel anxious. It's the real example is going to a movie theater, and you go and you're scared in the movie theater, but you know it's a movie. Why are you scared? It's a movie. You know it's not real. Your mind starts to make a real connection between what you're processing and what might occur. And that need for kind of certainty and understanding starts to kick in and move you to say, well, I'm not going to do whatever they're doing to get their arms chopped off or something to that effect. Something bad is happening. So we celebrate groups winning. We celebrate ideology more so than the system of government that is working to ensure that our democracy is aligned with the spirit of the words in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That self-investment, that kind of selfishness that we want, we see in candidates. And we actually invest in candidates, which is why you see a lot of candidates who don't tend to be focused on governing so much, but responding to citizens. They're reacting to what the customers are asking for. And therefore, we need to do something about changing the messaging around democracy and understanding how it works. This idea of kind of bias is self-serving, and it allows us to rationalize and justify the status quo, especially those systems that narrowly define who gets what, when, and how in society, and therefore what is merit. The way we think about who deserves what is based on a set of beliefs about what is valued, what is cherished, what is real merit. If you achieve merit, you're more likely to experience deservingness from those who are bestowing things. And if you don't achieve merit, then they tend to say, well, you don't deserve it, it's unfair if you receive it. That gap really creates resentments that keep us from having a unified democracy. Right. So I want to talk about myself a bit, because you've heard that I'm a professor and I'm a dean of public policy, but none of this happened overnight. My personal identity in many ways comes through kind of religion, but also race, region, and relationships. My mother came from American Indian heritage, and my father came from Panama and has Jamaican heritage. And my father landed in Roxbury and Dorchester in the 1950s, so my family is still in Mattapan and areas of Boston. And when I was a young child, my parents would often tell me that I was named David because of his Hebrew translation of the beloved, and because David in the Bible is viewed as the King of Kings, owing to his good heart. And of course, he slayed Goliath, and so he was a hero and a champion of justice. And somehow, perhaps, I internalized these ideas and these stories to realize that I have a soft spot for the oppressed. And I've often kind of communicated a desire to see justice myself. And maybe this is why I found myself interested in justice and the desire to step up when something needed to get done, just be a leader. So in a very subtle way, my name may have pushed me to become a leader, a professor, a dean, You've heard a bit about my military experience. Now, there are 600 million Davids in the world, and half of those have my last name, Wilson, and I could never get things like davidwilson.com or David Wilson at any university I've been at. So you'll see my middle initial often being touted, and my middle name is Christopher. My parents also told me stories about my middle name, which starts with Christ. Christ means bearer, or Christopher means bearer of Christ. And in the Catholic tradition, Christopher is the patron saint of travel. Ironically or not, almost everything I believe in ties to literally or figuratively travel. Traveling exposes you to difference. That difference expands your wisdom. That wisdom expands how you can help and guide others. And helping and guiding others is really what a David does, what a leader or a king does. I'm not a king, but I'm a dean, and I still have to lead. Travel is service leadership manifested. The more you travel, the more you experience diversity, the more you can really get a sense of who you are, and therefore cast a broad framework for identity and not a narrow framework that's defined by your friends, your family members, those who are local to you. I've been to all 50 states. I've been to every national park in the continental United States. I've been to every continent on the planet. I've been to over 75 countries across the globe, often risking my life to do really weird things. But all of this is just to say that my name actually causes me to reflect on my story. And your story helps you really craft a real identity around how you see yourself in our democracy and our broader set of decisions about who gets what, when, and how. Now, my mother and father met at Fisk University in Nashville in the mid-1960s, and my sister was born in 1968. I was born in 1970, and by 1972, my parents were divorced. And my sister and I spent the next 15 years splitting time between Boston and Nashville, Tennessee, between loved ones, navigating confusing disagreements, managing stress and anxiety, and trying to remain focused on loving our parents while also trying to understand why our parents might not have loved one another. And so exposure to divorce gave me firsthand lessons in politics, empathy, and justice as well. So why am I talking about all of this in the context of a 2024 election presentation? Well, because in these moments, we rarely take time to see one another and understand one another, and that's one of the challenges that we're facing in our elections and political systems today. The world is moving much faster than in the past. The information is much more massive, and our attention tends to focus on those cognitive shortcuts, those heuristics that promote things like status, stereotypes, and broader traits, rather than the essence of who we've come to be, our true identities. So I find those stories about background and who we are much more interesting than status. And so, off to politics. As you can imagine, a lot of what we do in politics is base our work on guiding documents. And so we are here at a preeminent college, Holy Cross, and this amazing lecture hall and library and center, and we have the privilege to live in a democracy that values freedom. The freedom to generate knowledge, the freedom to share knowledge. You often hear of academic freedom. That's the ability to think for yourself, generate knowledge, share that knowledge without persecution from others. It could be government, it could be media, it could be students and the like. It could be administration. Almost all knowledge leads to some truth, even if that truth is temporary, like the idea that two married persons may love each other forever. That is a temporary truth in many ways. We often forget or are unaware or sometimes deny that the truths that founded American democracy were temporary. They were designed to change, and therefore we as human beings should have been wired to actually accept and embrace change. But that's actually not the case. We're actually wired to resist change. So in the Declaration of Independence, it talked about all men being created equal men. It talked about men being governors of their own destiny. It talked about the formation of a government, and that government, when it becomes too oppressive, should be destroyed and rebuilt into something more palatable to the people. Well, to men, actually. This is a powerful statement about government, the Declaration of Independence. They were saying, we don't want to have an authoritarian leader. We don't want to have a king govern us. We want to self-govern. Now, they said this without a system of self-governance. they were a lot of different entities, a lot of different identities, and somehow they had to come to agreement. And they had to do so by sacrificing, giving up a little bit of something. So I'm sure the men part was not necessarily accurate. It was a temporary truth. I'm sure the who was in power, mostly white males, mostly people that owned lands, mostly people that were staunchly religious or at least believed in a certain economic or religious system, they were the ones who thought they ought to govern. But about 13 years later, some were smart enough to come together and take these independent states, these declared independent states, to become united. And therefore, you have this idea of a United States. And by this time, those men who were doing the governing drafted the rules of government and decided to include an introductory statement. And that introductory statement really talked about what we should value in our government. And it started out with, "We the people of the United States ordain and establish our Constitution for the United States of America, the country. And we do so in order to form a more perfect union." The first thing that they mention after forming a more perfect union is justice. They say, "Establish justice to ensure domestic tranquility." When you see polarization, when you see conflict, that is the antithesis of tranquility. So it signals that something is missing. And the framers of the Constitution knew what that was likely to be, and that's this perception of justice, this perception that government is being fair. We also had to do things like provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure blessings of liberty. The Constitution wasn't just an outline for government, it was the first official democracy policy for our country. And the first thing that this policy sought to do was establish justice. Now, the framers of the Constitution realized that justice was critical to forming a more perfect union, and when justice waned, so might our domestic tranquility. And therefore, we need rules that allow for change. The rules that are in the Constitution allow for change. And we need rulers who are willing to advance not only freedom, but also a government that serves the union's movement towards more perfection. Elections are tools that we use to identify leaders, and colleges and universities are actually those institutions that we value to help us become better citizens. This is the place that actually produces the real citizens of the U.S., real in the sense that you are working towards generating and understanding how knowledge is created so that you can actually serve a broader purpose than yourself. Others can do it a different way, but you've come here and sacrificed your time, some of your freedom, some of your happiness to really go through that hard process of learning, and that is critical and key to democracy. So those elections are important, the university is important, the quality of our democracy depends on the effectiveness of our institutions to work, including how we teach and train our students. Now, most people don't really care about justice, this idea of justice. It's a politicized term in many ways, and mostly cynics say, people have another way that they can figure things out. Justice is not a core motive. But research consistently shows over and over again that people believe in the idea of a just world, that we all imagine a world of rights and wrongs. And we enjoy and appreciate the right to be who we are, but we also want to be able to appreciate the right to change. We value positive. We tend to also pay attention to negative. And when negatives happen, and we think those negatives are unfair, we see injustice. Essentially, wrongs are undesirable, and if we allow them to exist, what's the point of being good? We have a fundamental motive around justice, that is a belief in a just world, that there is some right that will come from what we do. You all believe in some way that if you do everything you're supposed to do while you're here, you will get a degree. You will get some kind of credential. Imagine if that wasn't guaranteed. That would be a different form or a different system. What if we picked and chose, even though after you went through all the work, we picked and chose who would get the degree based on some random trait? It could be whether you're male or female. It could be whether you're rich or poor. It could be whether you have some physical trait or attribute. That would serve as an injustice because it violates the terms and spirit of what we agreed to around a constitution of equality and human rights. So our human desire for justice, often called a justice motive, is a double-edged sword because the idea of justice, the idea of fairness, a fairness that serves a common humanity, often requires us to have the same standards. If you think about what justice means to folks, There is no universal arbitrator to deal with when we disagree about justice. And so I hope you're starting to see a bit of the problem. You need someone to identify the standards and appoint the judges of what is just, and therefore what serves a democracy. Remember the earlier words about partial truths, where men do the governing and give feedback, and remember the words about being created equal. Well, this is the real challenge of democracy. We want justice, but what is just is constantly evolving. That part about temporary truths being identified and aligned and needing to change. Who is equal is constantly evolving. What is legal or not is constantly evolving. Who governs is constantly evolving. That is our democracy. And the discomfort you're feeling and seeing is about that violation of what you thought was something that was accepted and agreed upon. And that is that democracy will always be here. It will always be present. Justice will always live. But when there are threats to justice, we tend to become very constrained in our beliefs and hang with our tribes. Again, experiments show over and over again that the desire to maintain the illusion that justice exists and is necessary often leads us to cruel acts. If someone receives bad outcomes, it is human and instinctive for others to look at that person and ask, why? Not just accept that a bad outcome is bad no matter who it happens for, but that there's some appraisal that I need to think about before I give them pity and sorrow. I need to, if someone doesn't have a job and is homeless on the street, the first thing we don't do is say, this is bad, I'm going to give everything that I have to this person for equality's sake. We say, I wonder why. And you probably move very quickly to a reason that you can draw up fast than that person's actual reason. So we tend to use our psychology and our political minds to make decisions about who should get what, when, and how, and therefore deservingness. So the psychology of justice, having justice is a very balanced state. It's a calm. Merit equals outcomes. Your inputs lead to the things that you want. Good actions are rewarded. Bad actions are punished. They're not rewarded. As long as justice exists, there's a state of satisfaction. You're not really moved to much action. So if I'm a political consultant and I want you to move to action, what I do is I tend to talk about injustice. Injustice is an imbalanced state. It's disruptive to your status quo. It's when merits and outcomes don't align. Good actions are not being rewarded and bad actions are not being punished. The system is out of balance, and not just the legal system, but our psychological system. It creates dissatisfaction, and when you're dissatisfied, you must fix it. If there's an injustice, you must do something about it. If you get a grade you don't deserve, you're going to fight to try and get it back. If you get a grade you do deserve, you don't do much. Justice is not really an action motive. Justice is not really an action emotion. Injustice provokes action. And so when you're thinking about the advertising and political messaging you're seeing on both sides, and at all levels of government, they're designed to actually connect with your sense of justice and the idea that justice should look a certain way. Now, I'm a political psychologist, and of course, not many people know what political psychology is, so I'll just quickly explain that political psychologist is a study of the political mind. It's the study of how we make decisions, how we think about politics, and the process of actually making political decisions. Now, importantly, politics, in spite of what you see on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, politics is just the culture and behavior of group decision-making. That's all politics is. It's really about decision-making. It's how individuals decide what to do or not do about something that affects others. The key word are group and others. You don't need a politics to make your own personal decisions. You need politics when others are involved, only when others are involved. You might weigh different factors when you make decisions about yourself, but ultimately you're your own authority. In our democracy and in government, we're making decisions on behalf of others, and therefore we need to think broadly about what politics means and how it happens. So at this point, there's big P politics and there's small p politics. The big P politics are what you see on television. The small p politics are about those everyday decisions that you might make, those things that define our behaviors. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the small p politics. Those are those kind of procedures and practices about who gets what, when, and how in society, like when you get together and try and choose a movie on Netflix, how you decide, what are the rules, majority rule, supermajority rule, arm wrestle, who has the most money. There's something that you have to use and agree upon to make that decision. If you're at a reception There's a lot of people in the room. Who gets a smile? Who doesn't get a smile? Who gets a handshake or a hug? Who doesn't? We tend to give more status to some brands, some clothing brands and some car brands than others. Why is that? Why do we make attributions of status to brand names? Why we're drawn to drama and violence? Why we like action movies, and we sometimes even cheer for criminals to get retribution. John Wick, for example. Why we're less likely to help others in uncertain situations. Why we're motivated to resist change. Those are the small p politics that deal with the real decisions that happen every day. The things you see on television, those big P politics, individuals don't have much control over that. Groups do. And that's the part of government that really makes it hard for us to manage. So these 2024 elections, especially at the national level, are about small p politics, about who should get what, when, and how we form a more perfect union, how we establish justice, how we ensure domestic tranquility, and political psychology is how we, as those who study political behavior, how we understand political humans. We tend to say the words, the political actor, but we look at those internal mechanisms, those internal influences that drive our decision-making, and we look at the external influences that drive our decision-making. We try and make a connection between the two with experiments and really good research and understand everything from, your beliefs and your attitudes and your emotions and how they're influenced by media and group leaders and elites, and collect a series of studies and then make a really good judgment about what's going on. And it's like a puzzle. Every single study is just one piece. And then sometimes it turns out that one piece was in the wrong place and they take it out, and so more studies have to be done. So political psychologists are constantly in a state of trying to understand how people make decisions about voting, about who should get what, when, and how, about whether or not to volunteer and help someone, about how to contribute to a bigger picture in society. And so tonight, your takeaway shouldn't just be that political psychology is a cool field, but political psychology can help you understand how to think about what you already believe. It gives you a toolkit. So, one of the core elements of political psychology is identity. Your identity is a powerful influence on how you think and what you do. It is one of the most important elements that we study in psychology because it is kind of the essence of how we think about our role in the big picture. Scholars behind studies around identity, especially those who look at intergroup conflicts, they start by trying to eliminate all of the extraneous factors, the messiness of the world and all of these things, and we try and reintroduce one by one those complicating factors that would produce or reproduce intergroup conflict. In other words, politics involves others. Others means that there's you and there's others, and you normally belong to a group, others belong to a different group, hence the other, and we're trying to figure out what causes tensions. When there's no tension, there's justice, there's satisfaction. There's not much need to study that. But when there's tension, there's probably an injustice, and we need to understand how to reduce that injustice. What the research has shown that all humans, regardless of your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your religion, any other attributes where you're from, are driven to uphold a positive self-concept, a positive sense of yourself. This means that group identity is an important channel to help us validate ourselves. The groups we attach ourselves with, whether it's because of behavioral attributes or where you're from or how you see yourselves in terms of demographics, those are all designed to help us give meaning to who we are. Once we have a clearer understanding of who we are, we might be able to make better decisions in our own minds. We might be able to make more informed decisions that help us protect ourselves from suffering and all the ills of society. So the theory of social identity, that is how we see ourselves in relation to others in order to make good decisions, has four key components: categorization, distinctiveness, identification, and in-group favoritism. Those are core. There are a few more pieces within this, but these are really the core. And really what's important is that your mind doesn't wait for someone to tell you it's time to go to the next thing. It all happens very quickly in a process. When you walk into a room, you automatically know what's a chair. You don't need to stop and think about and get instructions about that. With a little bit of information, you automatically know who's playing a role of professor, and professors know who's playing the role of student. Sometimes it's unclear, but you have cues that help inform that. So identity starts with us being able to put things in the categories that give us information that we need. Categorization is key. So categorization, which is really critical to almost a host of things about how we think about the world, Those theories help us to understand how individuals fit within all the host of different identities. And we all understand and agree that we have different and multiple identities. However, social identity theory argues that people do not really have the bandwidth to think of themselves across a host of different identities. In essence, you've got so many identities that your mind can only use one at a time. And after a while, you start getting into conflicts when you try and realize that, well, if I hold two identities that I love life and I smoke cigarettes, cigarettes may kill, life is short, how do I rationalize these two identities, these two organizations kind of working together? The theory argues that people manage their complex self-concepts based on different cues. Things like whether we're in the majority or not, the extent to which our group is easily identified, how people feel about our group, what our group is perceived to have done or not done, the influence we have, who we are at any one given point depends on who else is around us. When you're thinking about the election and you're thinking about how we use parties, which are nowhere in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, think about how that can exist in a democracy. As a result of our use of categories, our environment structure the classification of people into groups. Sometimes we put people into groups that don't belong. We make mistakes. We use stereotypes to help us get around this cognitive mental challenge that we have. We use the criterion of shortcuts. We can randomly assign these shortcuts or these information cues based on what we know or based on what we've heard or just based on what we believe at any given moment. Categorization happens quickly, and once a categorization has taken place, it doesn't matter what you're categorizing, a cascade of human tendencies tends to follow. That leads to distinctiveness. Once you're categorized, people become psychologically invested in their in-group and how their group is distinctive from an out-group. Now imagine, once you have put yourself in a group, Holy Cross, for example, you can easily differentiate yourself from someone from WPI or from another university, easily. Even if you're exactly the same in terms of major, height, weight, race, age, gender, and everything, you will find a way. You are motivated to follow this process through. Distinctiveness is what makes a group unique and special, and it consists of many attributes and norms that define, again, who we are. It feeds who we are and how we should behave. And since we're all motivated to acquire, maintain, and enhance a positive self-image of ourselves, positive, we're doing great things, we're good people, we must strive to ensure that our group is distinctive and therefore justify our membership. In other words, and we'll get to this when we get to in-group, you will promote your identity and your group's identity above others, naturally. It doesn't mean you're derogating the other group, but it means you are elevating your group and your status, and therefore all of those things that are connected to your group and your status. The policies, politics, decisions, locations, all of those other things that come along with being in a group. When you have distinctiveness, you're thinking about who belongs in the group, what criteria they have to meet to be in the group, whether they ought to get things on the back end of being in the group. In other words, is there a status within the group that matters as well? How are group members expected to behave, and what are they supposed to believe? There are sanctions for being in a group, but not believing in what the prototypical group member thinks, which is why you see sometimes the Democratic Party being seen as a big tent, because they share the identity of one party, but they all have a host of different identities that have to be managed within that. Whereas in the Republican Party tends to be more homogeneous, but there's still some variance, and most people that deviate from the norm tend to be sanctioned and say that you're a Republican in name only and other kinds of attributes like that. So in this complex world we live in with streams of information that are exceeding our ability to think about things in a certain way, a very consistent and specific way, the distinctiveness of an in-group provides its members with meaning, security, and direction. That's powerful. When you're insecure, when you're unstable, you're in a constant state of anxiety and stress, and you tend to close ranks around self. You tend to be very conservative, not in the political sense, but conservative in decision making. You tend to withhold things. You tend to even withhold empathy in many ways. So although distinctiveness of in-groups can emerge organically, at least in politics, it's often structured by institutions and individual actors, especially candidates. The key is that once groups are formed, distinguished, and given meaning, members work to maintain their membership or their identification with that group. So once again, Once you've categorized yourself in a group, you're now motivated to make your group unique and distinctive, and then promote identification. So to be clear, and I hope Hannah Thompson's not in the room, I just found that on the internet. To be clear, one's identity is with a group. It's an in-group. The core element of your in-group membership is the centrality or importance of that group membership to a person. When I talked about things that are cherished, identity and statuses that are cherished sometimes, whether you're on an athletic team, whether you're in a fraternity or a sorority, whether you're in a certain major or a certain college, or you're affiliated with a certain field, that bestows some status. And again, you are motivated to optimize the value of that status so that you are optimized as well. It's not the case that individuals either identify with a group or not, but rather the degree to which they identify with a group. The importance of group membership, higher or lower importance, not the binary of I'm in or I'm not in. Again, everything is constantly moving and shifting. These differences of identification and categorization and distinctiveness determine who is more sensitive to the stimuli that happens between groups. How much you take one thing that a person says that belongs to a group and extrapolate it to the entire group. That process of thinking and attribution is critical to how we make political decisions. Now, the last part of part of identity is favoritism, and that is the inclination to cognitively and effectively privilege one's own in-group with respect to an out-group. This includes a deeper and more detailed processing of information. So when you are in an in-group, you are kind of satisfied with your in-group members. You don't need to process a lot of information about them. You give them the benefit of the doubt. Out-group members, that's different. Not only can you come up with instances of why they did something, but if they do something that is similar to your group, remember, they can't be in your group and out of your group at the same time. If they do something that's similar to what you perceive your group to do, you are still motivated to make your group distinct. They're still never doing enough. So when you think about group memberships, party, race, gender, and the like, there's always this rub about whether or not there's a we, going back to we the people, in a democracy. There's always going to be factions. So when you're thinking about the key to a democracy, is how do we resolve that tension? How do we deal with it? And we don't have an answer. It's all human. Research within most of these minimal group experiments around favoritism, they randomly assign different identities to see how favoritism plays itself out. And you may have seen stuff around implicit bias, and you may have had training in bias and the like. That's what this is really trying to get us to do, be more aware of how we have favoritisms and how we distribute our preferences. But in-group favoritism can also manifest as in-group members expressing more positive feelings toward their in-group, we call that prejudice, or more positive stereotypes toward one's in-group, another form of prejudice, or supporting public policies or ideologies that privilege one's own group, and we tend to call that bias. They're all different versions of these words. But the bigger insight into these group differences is that in-group favoritism is not spread, in-group favoritism is not the spread of ways, is not the way it expresses itself, but rather the idea that we're faultless when we have favoritism. In-group favoritism privileges us, which often divorces ourselves from any antipathy towards them. This is important because it suggests that being a pro-minority, pro-whatever minority group, not just racial, gender, and the like, but pro-minority, doesn't mean that you're automatically rejecting the majority. It means that one can be pro-black without being anti-white. One can be pro-Palestinian without being pro-Israel and anti-both. And one can be pro-women without being anti-men. This idea that we have favoritism doesn't necessarily mean that we dislike the out-group. Now, this gets us back to the original point and understanding identity and how we make decisions in a democracy. We want a democracy that works for everyone, but our political mind is not wired for that. The key challenge is around justice and how we deal with what's right, what's wrong, what's fair. The election is just a method for deciding who our leader is. How do we decide? Politics, how do we decide? We decide using what we know, how we think about ourselves, and what our motives are. So if you're really trying to understand what's going to happen and why our politics look the way they do, all we have to do is look in the mirror. Politicians are not driving the public. The public is driving the politics. And this is because of a natural tendency for us to want to self-enhance in an environment that requires us to do it more and more, faster and faster and the like. hence $700 million being spent in political ads at local level and hardly any investment in most nonprofit, philanthropic, or community-based organizations that are trying to really build democracy. So I co-authored a book, and just share a little bit about my research. Co-authored a book with a guy named Darren Davis at Notre Dame University, and we started writing the book around 2016, and we were motivated by this idea that when Trump was running for office in 2016, or thereabouts, that people would often go to race quickly. And once they were at race, they only had a few things that they could talk about, and that was racism and prejudice. And there was no other way to really think about race in the political mind. And so it was fair that you would find people often saying, well, I'm not a racist. And what Darren and I thought to do was say, well, does that matter? Does it really make a difference that you don't dislike a group or you don't hate a group based on who they are? You might just dislike that you have to deal with race. You might believe that it's unfair that race is something that gets in the way of your status quo, your ability to advance democracy in the way you think is just and right. So this concept of racial resentment is grounded in this same idea that I talked about before, belief in a just world. And we talked about what's just in terms of being legitimate. When something happens and it's legitimate and it's rewarded, it's okay. When something happens and it's not legitimate but it's rewarded, there's an injustice. The scales of justice are imbalanced. The reason why you see racial resentment is because race is perceived to be an illegitimate source of merit. Using race in anything, in some people's minds, is unfair and unjust, primarily because there are others who can't benefit from the use of race. They're demonized if they use race. That tension goes all the way back to social identity. It goes back to how we try and distinguish ourselves, how we rationalize our thoughts, how we make decisions about who gets what, when, and how, even if the other, not us, the other is suffering or in a lower status. The bottom line is race is not always perceived to be something that's a barrier to success. It's not something that always matters. It's not a source of merit. Dislike and hatred, prejudice and racism aren't required for resentment. There are many things that we resent in the world. How they become racialized can depend on a host of factors. It doesn't always mean that your racial attitudes are explicitly prejudice and racism. But again, the question is, does it matter? So we didn't stop at trying to really get at racial resentment for whites. We also looked at racial resentment for African Americans. The racial part is the part about identity that's important, the part about how individuals in the public, the average person, thinks about what others are getting as a result of something that they don't deserve, as a result of a criteria they feel is unfair. So whites tend to think about racial resentment racial resentment toward African Americans because they're thinking about special considerations, that African Americans are using race as a way to kind of get around merit criteria and avoid responsibilities. In other words, we have these survey questions, and one of them might be that African Americans are deserving of support because they could work hard or do more on their own. They should do more on their own. But racial resentment can actually exist among African Americans as well towards whites. African Americans may view that whites are not actually thinking about race in a way that is consistent with reality, and that they tend to use race as a way to oppress others and deny responsibility for their own work in the economic, social, and political space. In other words, whites are undeserving of support in their status because even if an African American or Latin person or an immigrant works really, really, really hard, discrimination gets in the way of their ability to get the outcome, their ability to see justice. And therefore, that's unfair. I'm angry about that. We need to do something about that. So when you see advocacy, you see pushing against the status quo, that's grounded in the belief that the world is just, that the Constitution is the set of rules we agree upon. When people are violating the idea that I'm working hard, I'm doing my part, but I'm not getting what I should get, they are really sensing an injustice. All right, so racialized resentment is not necessarily prejudice. And wanted to just kind of talk about this for the academics in the world or those who have taken statistics and enjoy this kind of thing. We dove into this quite a bit and tried to look at what our measure of racial resentment, primarily this is just for white Americans in the General Social Survey, what is our measure of racial resentment correlated with? And we theorized about its grounding in justice and the like. And we thought that, yeah, there are stereotypes that people use about African Americans, see if I get this right, such as work ethic, blacks are hardworking versus lazy, it's a scale, or that blacks are rich versus poor, or intelligent versus unintelligent. These are traditional measures of racism and prejudice that are used. They are on the lower end of the correlation scale. In other words, the more racial resentment you have, the more you hold these certain beliefs with the positive relationship. And the negative relationship is the more you have racial resentment, the less you have these beliefs. The strongest relationships are around things like, I'm tired of hearing people talk about racial problems. Whites are treated better. This is a disagreement that whites are treated better. In other words, do whites have privilege or not? The more racial resentment you have, the less you believe whites are privileged. And then this question around racial discrimination is not my business. I'm not contributing to the problem. It doesn't have anything to do with me. The more racial resentment you have, the more you say things like racial discrimination is not my business. Factors like I'm colorblind don't really correlate well with racial resentment, and the importance of one's racial identity. When we talk about just racial identity, that is not explicitly correlated. In other words, what we find is that the explanation between identity and resentment are these beliefs about who ought to get what, when, and how, and under what conditions, these merit criteria. So racial resentment explains the relationship for us between this sense of identity and feeling like you're angry about what African Americans might get. And that's just one example of many studies that we've done, but it's the way in which, again, identity gets infused into our politics and therefore our decisions about elections. We didn't just look at things like racial resentment in terms of a dependent variable, we looked at different policy outcomes. So we found that higher racial resentment increased support for strict voter ID laws. In other words, the requirement that you actually have to have an ID, a voter ID that's signed and administered by government. You can't use your student ID. Restrictions on felon voting rights, lower corporate taxes, the Supreme Court, support for the Supreme Court, repealing Obamacare. Higher resentment leads to more support to repeal Obamacare. Higher resentment leads to more support for the Affordable Care Act. And if you're curious, this is an experiment we published on. They're the same things. So that people, when it's framed as Obamacare, racial resentment predicts lower support. When it's framed as the Affordable Care Act, people with higher resentment are okay with it, no problem. It's another way to kind of draw out what's behind political decision making. Privatization of prisons, dress codes in schools, the ways in which we treat people in schools, and of course, even basic elements like mass transportation because of who is probably going to benefit from mass transportation more. We also found that higher racial resentment increased opposition to firearms and background checks, climate change policy, anything that Obama or Democrats propose, minimum wage increases, policies that help the poor, Medicare, education spending, public and private schools we found, and paying college athletes, NIL things. So racial resentment doesn't just target, here's the key, doesn't just target racial policy. It is how we perceive race as part of identity. And it doesn't mean that we have to hold that identity at a high level. It just means that we are looking at race as an identity factor, a political factor. Hence the original showing of the book around how identity politics is now more and more part of our democratic process and democratic politics. So almost done here. Just to take us back to your belief in a just world is real. You believe that people ought to get what they deserve and deserve what they get. When something violates that, you're either going to be angry about it, or if it's your in-group member, you're going to try and rationalize it. Or if you should legitimately feel sorry for someone that's in suffering in a country or a war-torn environment where genocide is happening, you tend to move towards blaming the victim or denying that you have any role in that. That allows us to sustain our sense of self-concept and justice. I'm still a good person. It's not that I dislike them. It's not that I'm inherently evil or anything. It's just that if they would just do more, they would be in the same situation as me. We don't tend to look at ourselves as the problem. This is the new American political culture and democracy. It's new because we see it more on television, not because human beings are different. So if we get to the end state of all of this, why do we see things like racial injustice, gender injustice, economic injustice across a host of different identities and groupings, even with all the progress we've made in American society? Why is change so difficult? It's because we're motivated to see the world through a status quo system of merits. Who should get what, when, and how? We set the criteria for ourselves. We include our identity as part of that decision-making process. This makes the commitment to kind of concrete actions difficult. In other words, coming to consensus in a democracy, in our party system, local, state levels much easier, national levels harder. And then when we get angry when injustices do occur, that resentment piece, not just on race, but on anything connected to an identity, that hinders our ability to move forward and advance our democracy. When our elections come about, we are thinking about these things. They are top of mind. Our feelings are driving our decision-making much more than the rules of the game, per se. And you can imagine that if you were taking a class and the professor was distributing things on the basis of feelings rather than a set of written criteria in the syllabus, the Constitution, that there would be a little bit of detanglement, a little injustice there to rectify. So just to summarize, political psychology helps us to dig deep on some of this stuff. It's not always easy just to make the straight line. That's the whole point of being a scientist in the field of political psychology, is that we have to really look within people's minds, and they don't want us in there. And guess what? When we really study people, if we start studying them too much, they start to do what? Change. No one likes to be figured out in advance. That makes you vulnerable. So anyway, that's political psychology. That's why I'm so engaged in thinking about justice, democracy, and elections. We have really high standards in our democracy. They're at odds with our abilities in many ways. These injustices don't just stop with winning and losing. They promote how we feel, and that feeling lingers on. Resentment has an enduring quality and trait to it, and we need to do something about it. And once something is done and it's permanent, that resentment can wane. But it does get in the way of our ability to appreciate just letting somebody else win, shaking their hand, saying good match, good contest, and then moving on and waiting to the next election. So when you saw January 6th events, a lot of people were saying, well, what are we supposed to do? They're not listening to us. Their best idea was not waiting till the next election. It was to let their anger express itself in the way that human anger does, through rage and violence, irritation, and of course, trying to justify it on the back end that there's a good reason for it. We have to be aware of these things. We have to think about them broader than just partisanship. We have to really dig deep and collect data and study. So thank you for listening, and I hope you all participate and engage on next Tuesday, if you haven't already. Thank you.